So the first part of what I want to talk about tonight is how we got to the point that that happens in Iraq. Then the second part of what I want to talk about is there anything in any of this process of national reconciliation, of truth seeking, that might be useful in Georgia, that might be useful in the process of democratic consolidation? Already, I think, the most advanced process of democratic consolidation in the region. Is there anything in this that could help that process deepen further? And my colleague Jenny Munro will also talk at the end a little bit about the research that we've been doing on comparative cases of processes of coming to terms with abuses of human rights. And then we'll have lots of time for discussion and questions. I've laid out for you in the notes everything that I could say. I've only got 35 minutes, so I'm not going to try and cover all of that. But rather, what I'd like to do is try and pick out some of the major drivers that have created this architecture of transitional justice and national reconciliation processes. If I sound cynical, I'm actually not, as you'll find out at the end. But along the way, there'll be a certain amount of cynicism in what I'm about to say. If I begin with the statement that if you do not master your past, which is an impossible process, but an absolutely necessary one, then it will master you. So you have to begin by thinking about what it is you want to achieve. And often, in these cases, it seems to me, we don't spend enough time thinking about what success would look like. Is success closure? In the Iraqi case, is it closure on the genocide against the Kurds? Is it somehow reconciliation between Shia and Sunni? What would that look like? What would success look like in that context? How do we achieve it? There are these terms, lustration, which I've been accused by one of my colleagues of making up, but it really is, as I'm sure many of you know, a term about exploring the past of your judiciary to see if their performance is governed by ideology or by the law. And there are many kinds of lustrations, and we'll come on to that in a bit. Prosecution, truth and conciliation commissions, dialogue, politics itself. Which past do we want to muster? What is year zero? And year zero is a terribly important question. Where does the process you want to examine begin? One of the examples that Jenny researched in the Czech Republic looked at abuses of property law under the communist regime, but didn't look at Sudeten Germans or Czech Jews who'd had their property stolen. It carved out a very specific space and said, that's what we're going to look at. And that could work very well. But what is that year zero? The year zero from which all of this stems is 1945. 1945 is also the birth of modern human rights, with the San Francisco Convention, the creation of the UN. Germany is defeated. And there's the question of German guilt. The Nuremberg trials pick out some leaders and put them on trial. Most of the cases at Nuremberg, as I'm sure you know, were not about the Holocaust. They were about the breaking of treaties and the aggression of Germany. But they raised this huge question of what was the nature of German guilt. How were you going to rebuild from that year zero? And Karl Jaspers, a philosopher who had lived quietly during the war, refusing to take part in the removal of Jewish academics from his university, published in 1948 a book called The Question of German Guilt. And in it, he articulated this notion of there being different categories of guilt. Metaphysical guilt. We are all guilty because we are alive in this polity at the moment at which these crimes were committed. Political guilt. If you didn't sacrifice your life in fighting the Nazis, you are politically guilty in taking part in this regime. Moral guilt, the guilt that you deal with between yourself and your God. And criminal guilt. You committed a crime, and therefore you should go to court for that crime. 4 different categories, some collective ideas of guilt, some individual ideas of guilt. And Jaspers argued that Germans could come to terms with their guilt if they talked to each other about it. In a sense, what he wanted to do was say that the moral guilt of the individual, your guilt before God, was really where you could cure, in some sense, your polity. You could remake your body politic. Because we're all guilty in Germany. There's collective political guilt. And that idea was very important for the Allies. They leapt on that because it meant that they could stop the denazification process and rehire a lot of Nazis to get the German state going again, to slow down the judicial process. They'd had Nuremberg. Now let's just get going. Let's get this country moving. Let's bring in people on the basis of competence. And that there's a huge logic in that position. But somehow it didn't work. And there's an unease about it, which is exposed most sharply by Hannah Arendt in her work, particularly her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. And Arendt's critique is, but if we're all guilty, then none of us are guilty. If we have just collective guilt, then in a way, we're letting everybody off the hook. And Arendt's and the Eichmann trial and Arendt's work is hugely important in restarting judicial processes in West Germany. And a whole series of new trials begin of much lower level operatives. So one of the drivers is this understanding of guilt and the evolution of our understanding of guilt. In parallel to this process of the critique of Jaspers is the rise of the victim. The other thing that happens after the Eichmann trial is a huge interest in the Holocaust. Primo Levi initially publishes If This Is a Man in 1957 in a very obscure publisher who produces very, very few copies. After Eichmann, the world's first global media event, there's suddenly a huge interest about the Holocaust and about victims. And who are the victims? What is the story of the victims? And there's a hugely successful television series in the United States on the Holocaust, which suddenly brings this story into very sharp focus. And it alters the evolving discourse in the human rights world to place much more centrally the idea of the victim in the discussions of human rights abuses. So, we have the development of the human rights industry on the one hand, which is very law-based, dominated by lawyers. We have the reimagining of Jaspers' notion of guilt by Arendt and others to say that we actually have to judge public acts, not like private acts, but in terms of the good that they do in the world. We should judge our public servants by the impact of their actions, not privately in terms of their God. And we have the other driver of victims, of the centrality of witness, of ideas of the victims of conflict not just being those who are killed, but those who are traumatized, changing the terms of debate about who is a victim of a gross violation of human rights. And that introduces notions of transitional justice. The idea that in a period after regime change, there needs to be something that addresses political guilt, but much more in the sense of Arendt than Jaspers. Political guilt that looks at the actions of public servants against a measure of what they do in terms of the good of the world. The processes of truth and reconciliation commissions themselves. The politics of apology for previous crimes. And all of these kind of strands come together in the Durban Conference in 2000. Heavily influenced by 1995 and the creation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. There has been no regime change in Georgia, there's been a change of government. That's a huge difference from any other cases that I've mentioned today. Obviously a huge change from Iraq. So you have to look at what might have gone wrong on an institutional basis within the existing regime. And that's the real opportunity that Georgia has for democratic consolidation at the moment. Or you could simply look at individual performance. You could look at judiciary, you could look at politicians, and you could say, well, who has broken or bent the rules? Who are we going to bring criminal prosecution against? And let me chance my arm and say, I think that there's been an institutional failure that needs a systemic response. And that could be a commission that looks at everything and proposes changes or the support for existing changes that have taken place. But you need 4 things in place before you do that. And then I'll stop and hand over to Jenny. First, you need to take this out of present politics. So you need to be sure that this isn't my turn. I'm in power now, so I get the goodies. And I screw the people who used to be in power because they're not in power anymore. Okay? You've got to be sure it's not about present politics, but it is actually about democratic consolidation. Now, to go back to Iraq, which feels like a safer example for me to talk about, which is an unusual situation. Go back to Iraq. There's nothing in it for the Shias to take conciliation out of present politics. What do they gain? The only thing they gain is that the common enemy of humanity, the common enemy of the Shia and the Sunni, ISIS, Daesh, gains if they don't pursue conciliation. And that's the argument that we're trying to make there through every means that we can. That unless they actually pass a new justice and accountability law and a new de-Baathification law, the only winners are Daesh. The only winners are the terrorists and the extremists on both sides. So you've got to work out a way here to make the argument that this is not about present politics. And I guess there are 3 things that you could argue. One is, if you can restore faith in the judiciary and restore the electorate's faith in the political system, there are huge economic benefits to that in terms of foreign inward investment. If property law is sorted in some way, if these cases are dealt with ethically, then confidence in Georgia as a place to invest, and therefore a place for jobs, massively increases. Secondly, the political argument, which I think I've made, is that if you can do this successfully, you consolidate democratic processes. But it's tough. How do you win that argument about present politics? You need an elite bargain. I'm sorry to bring up Huntington, but it's hard not to sometimes. You need an elite bargain. You need a bargain within the elite that you isolate those who have abused and broken the system so that you can fix it. You need institutional openness to change. So in a way, you need the judiciary to accept the need for judicial review, for peer-to-peer assessment of the quality of judges and judgments and so on. And that's possible. You can win that argument. It's difficult. And finally, you need an acknowledgement of guilt. If you really want to transcend the institutional failure, and if there is something in this transitional justice approach that is meaningful for Georgian politics, you need an acknowledgement from those who are at the top and most guilty of the abuse of the system that the system was broken, that things went too far, that there was abuse. And that can be a symbolic thing. It can be a gesture. And it's a necessary prerequisite for this being taken out of the idea of present politics. I've absolutely no idea how you get that in Georgia in a political context, but I think it's absolutely essential that you do. So that was the case in Iraq, a little bit about Georgia. I want to invite my colleague Jenny to come up and say a little bit more about the cases that we looked at, that we compared to look at whether there were some processes that might be useful in a Georgian context, and then we'll take any questions that you have.